Thank you very much for coming back after lunch. We are, again, very honoured to have three fantastic speakers with us this afternoon, all doing their TED Talks. This lady is Lloyd-Williams, talking about autism in women and girls, speaking from a personal perspective. And I'm going to have to ask everyone to be as quiet as possible because Ree isn't using the microphone.
Just to be awkward.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, Lloyd-Williams, thank you very much.
I'm going to try and rely on my Eisteddfod training to project to the back of the room. Hopefully you can hear me. Hello, I am Ree and I grew up here in Aberystwyth and I was diagnosed with ASD as an adult. Since being diagnosed, I've been writing about my experience of autism in my blog, autistry.com, and have recently been longlisted for the New Welsh Review and AberUni's Welsh Writing Awards with my essay collection about being autistic called The Wrong Kind of Happiness. I also have my first play coming to the Arts Centre on the 8th of June called The Duck, which is about my experience of coming to terms with a late diagnosis of autism. I love sharing my words with the autistic community because it doesn't matter how strange my experience, somebody else has been through exactly the same. And that is an incredible thing when you've spent a lifetime alone in your own neurology. I thought I was unique. Instead, it turns out I'm just a completely normal autistic. Since this is the Welsh Autism Show and my latest article is about hiraeth, it seemed apt that I should share it here. Hiraeth for autism. Hiraeth is an untranslatable Welsh word. It's often described as homesickness or a sort of nostalgia, but these translations don't touch on the strength of that feeling. Hiraeth is a deep longing for somewhere. It's that pull within your chest for a space where you belong. It's that feeling when you get when you smell the scent of home, or when the wind ripples through the grass in just the right way. When I lived in England for more than a decade, I would feel hiraeth for home. Crossing the Severn Bridge would begin to alleviate it. The further I travelled through the hills, over and under the rolling valleys, the further I went, the more I felt surrounded by home. I have hiraeth for my memories of standing on a hilltop as a teen, the sea in the distance, the undulating hills, the unavoidable sheep, the threads of different shades of green that slipped from here to there, my home, my connection to the world. That connection was never really through people, it was always deeper. My hiraeth was in the bones of the land, in the rocks of the Cambrian mountains, ancient and layered in their slumber. It was in the skies above where the buzzards and red kites swooped and the dawn chorus roared in defiance. My hiraeth kept me connected to the land and it gave me a deep sense of belonging that people could not provide. I had not found my space in the world of humanity. I did not know why I was out on the edge and I felt it keenly, but I knew there was this place that I called home. I had another hiraeth that yearned at me. I needed to belong and I did not, no matter how hard I tried. I did not have a name for my inner place of belonging, not until my autism diagnosis. My hiraeth for home brought me back to Wales. My hiraeth for belonging brought me to the autistic community. I am no longer the lonely traveller banging on empty doors. I am a person who connects in her own ways with her own people. Hiraeth for autism is a longing to belong and to be like other people, a deep need not to be alone in your neurotype. The knowledge that you are not faulty, you are different. That people do not respond to your natural communication forms because theirs have another style, but there are people who do share yours. We all need to feel connected. We all have hiraeth for something. I know who I am and I know where I am from, and these are powerful things. My hiraeth was rootless and flailing for many years. Now it has found another foundation, another connecting, another belonging. So that was my latest article. I am not inspiring. I am just me. Just another person making their way through the world as best I can. I have a selfish motivation for being here, not a selfless one. I want the world to be a better place for people like me. I want that little girl, and much of this applies to boys too, but I was a little girl and I'm selfish, so I'm going to talk about her. I want that little girl growing up bemused by human behaviour to be told that she's right. It's baffling and confusing, you make no sense, you're fascinating and brilliant, but she's right, it's strange. I want that girl to grow up never being told, you can't feel that because I don't, about her sensory issues. I want her to learn that stimming is natural and beautiful and to be guided gently towards the stims that work with who she wants to be. So I gesticulate a lot while I talk. I'm not actually doing that to communicate with you. Again, selfish. I'm stimming. I'm using it to show myself where my body is. I'm rocking back and forth constantly. None of it's about you. It's all about me. I want her to learn that communicating online is not a strange and distant way of having friendships. That it is actually a time that the playing field is levelled for autistic people. We all have to deal with just words on a screen. I want her to learn that many of the social rules she will learn are not fixed, and she needs to know which are which. I want her to learn that her neurology will give a different angle for viewing the world, and that is valuable and necessary, and the world is less without us. I want her to have puberty and menstruation explained to her in great detail what to expect, how upsetting the uncertainty of all the changes, how that reaction is so very normal. All explained without euphemisms, because euphemisms are the enemy of clarity. If she decides she wants to go to university, I want her to know she is supported in all that terrifying change, but that she can take control of her life and be what she wants to be. I want to show her the value of creativity. I do not know any autistic women who do not have this strong drive to be creative. From the coders to the artists, we all have a strong drive for that in our lives. It's very healing. When she goes for her first job, I want her never to have to see the line, good communication skills necessary, because that doesn't mean anything and it's terrible communication. Oh, don't you? I could go on about that for a while. I want information to be available to her through technology. Google Maps was a revelation. I can now picture a place before I visit there. I don't have to do all the processing here and now. I can actually do the work before I arrive. Better websites, floor plans of layouts, photos of rooms. Let me drown in the inclusivity of too much information. I want her to grow up understanding that some things will always be difficult, and working with her autism and not against it. Today I am standing here speaking happily. Tonight those words will fly from me like a flock of starlings leaving the pier, and I will sit in a darkened room with noise-cancelling headphones on and hope that the over-processing I've done today won't trigger the inevitable migraine, which it will. I have planned to rest. I have planned for tomorrow to be a gentle day of doing nothing, to recover from the over-processing today, because if I don't, that will knock on and knock on and knock on and take from me. In the past, I didn't. I forced my way through. I pushed on, telling myself not to be lazy, asking myself why I was so useless at this humanity. Until my ever-sensible brain, which is a lot cleverer than I am, exhausted and battered, would put me in shutdown for a while. It said, if you're not going to stop, I'm going to have to make you, and it would force me to rest. I want her to know that she may be enormously empathetic, that so many autistic people are, but that because we don't always perform empathy the way other people do, that it may be misunderstood, that misunderstandings will happen a lot, that people may think you're arrogant or cold or aloof when you're actually just not quite performing the expressions they expect. I am excellent in a crisis. I am not warm or tactile, but I go straight into hyper-focus and problem solving, and that's a really useful skill to have. When she gets older, if she chooses to have children, I want her to be surrounded by healthcare professionals who listen. I want her midwives to respect that she might not want to be touched for sensory reasons. I want them to understand that whilst they may not be visible as expressions or body language, a new person or action may trigger a fight or flight response, and that adrenaline slows down labour and causes problems. In a wider context, I want her to be safe if she doesn't respond to pain in the ways that other people do. If she goes quiet, loses her words, takes the pain chart from smiley face to sad face, literally, and says, I'm not any of those. I want that woman's workplace to respect her communication preferences. I want the lighting to be as far from fluorescent as it can be. I want her to never have to sit near a fire exit sign that whines constantly. Yes. I want her to never be passed over for promotions because she's not good at small talk. I want her strengths to be the focus and her weaknesses to be supported. I want her to be judged on her output and not her presenteeism. I want her to be able to bring her creativity and hyper-focus and problem-solving into her everyday life. I want her special interests to be cultivated into a vocation. All these things are achievable. Not only are they achievable, they would actually make life better for most people, not just the chosen few. Everyone has sensory issues at work, they just tend not to be quite as pronounced in non-autistics. If you've ever been bothered by the noise of drilling in another office or somebody's tuna sandwich at a desk, you've had negative sensory input at work that has caused a problem for you. The less there is in an environment, the less sensory problems there are, the better it is for everyone, but the more accessible it is for autistic people. Autistic girls often present differently to autistic boys. They may present as incredibly shy, tactile, anxious. The wonderful autism expert Sarah Hendricks said that little boys often present as little professors, whereas little girls are little psychologists. Social skills are considered more important in girls, so the autistic girl may well learn to mirror and copy ways of doing things in an attempt to fit in. Many will appear fine in school, where they are performing and masking all day, but have meltdowns and shutdowns and utter exhaustion at home, which can make it really hard to get schools to see the problem. I am from the missed generations of autistic women. Traditionally, it has been thought of as a boy's condition. It'd be easy to think that that's still true when we look at all the male autistic characters in the media. Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory, Joe in The A Word, The Rain Man, so many boys and men. I never saw anyone like me growing up. Now it's realised that back then most of the girls who were diagnosed had additional learning difficulties, so the other 2/3 were being missed because they were able to mask their autism. Training in how girls' presentation with autism may differ is incredibly important for all teaching staff, carers and medical professionals. During a time of stress, I once described to a counsellor in great detail a period of shutdown, and she told me that brains don't work like that. Someone who could have been the first step towards my diagnosis instead told me that my lived experience hadn't happened. And that is pretty much how everyone has always reacted to my autism. When the sound of pound coins clinking together set off reflex taste hallucinations, I was told not to be silly. When cutlery scraping plates caused me intense pain, it was laughed at. When I didn't like to be hugged because it made my skin feel undone, I learned to be quiet to get it over sooner. When I described my synesthesia and how all numbers are shapes and feelings, I was told that they're not. When I needed rest after school because I was so exhausted from consciously processing everyone else's body language and expressions whilst projecting mine, I was told I was an angry child and a sulker. I thought that must be true. I had no idea that when other children had tantrums, they were in control. I remember those meltdowns as scary times when I didn't exist for a little while. When I couldn't sleep because this noisy brain of mine just wouldn't shut up, I was alone in the dark. When I continued to carry around my blanket and rub it between my fingers, I was called childish, and I learnt to go and hide in the toilets to stim. What did I learn? I learnt that my pain wasn't real, and I wasn't to react to it. I learnt that other people can tell me what to do with my body, and they are right, even if it causes me pain. I learnt that my natural reactions weren't real, and shouldn't be listened to or mentioned at all. I learnt I was wrong. And that's why I'm here, selfishly. To make sure that little girl or boy growing up now will know that they are not wrong, that they will learn to understand how they work and that they are worthy of respect. I am not inspiring. I'm just me, and I am me, all of me. Diagnosis gave me permission to explore who I actually am, and that is a magical and wonderful thing. I don't want to be inspiring. I don't want autism awareness. I want to go right through autism understanding and come out the other side into autism mundanity. I want to be able to say I'm autistic and never have to worry that someone is going to reply with, "Gosh, you don't look it." Which always means my work is not done. I want them to know autism so well that the fact is boring.
Yeah.
That's my dream anyway. A day when autism is understood and truly accepted. When I'm just not inspirational at all. I'm simply human. And we will get there together.
Okay, thank very much for that incredible insight. I for once lost for words. That was amazing. Thank you. Our next gentleman up is a gentleman called Alex Lowery, and Alex is talking about a guide to neurotypicality. Yes, okay. Okay. Yep. Use the microphone as well. Yes. Okay, Alex, everybody. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Is this picking me up here? It's a real honour to be speaking for you all today. My name is Alexander Lowery and I'm on the autistic spectrum. Now today I'm going to be doing a funny talk. Well, at least I hope it'll be funny. People have told me it is, but that's not really for me to judge. And that's a talk, you know, like when you see like talks on autism. I mean, I normally give talks on autism, but this is a talk which is basically reversed, where I'm talking about neurotypicals. Or in this case, people who aren't affected by autism. Now, but first, before I start, here is a disclaimer. I'm aware that technically speaking, the term neurotypical can be applied to anybody who doesn't have a neurological condition, which may not necessarily just mean autism. It could include, like, if someone is dyslexia, technically they're not neurotypical. Or if someone has ADHD, they're also not neurotypical. But this list is more specific to those who aren't autistic, should we say. And it is still used more commonly in the autism community, I'd say. It definitely seems that way. Also, this talk is a parody, so it's not meant to be offensive to people who are neurotypical. Also, it's very much generalization, so not necessarily every single neurotypical on the whole planet will be able to relate to all of these points. And not necessarily every person who will be able to relate to them will automatically be NT either. It is very much a generalisation, but when we read autism lists, are they not often generalisations as well? And rarely are they applicable to every single autistic person out there. So without any further ado, let's move on to this topic. Now I'm going to be providing you with a guide to neurotypicality. Okay, now basically, I hope that you'll gain a lot of understanding from this talk and you'll learn more about this often misunderstood condition. So I really want to raise awareness of this. Okay, now what is neurotypicality? Well, firstly, this is a lifelong condition, so it doesn't go away. There is no known cure for it. However, many people with age and progress, with age and experience, can make progress. And learn to fit in with those of us who don't have the condition. It's also a spectrum condition, so just how severely affected by it someone is varies greatly. And as well as this, it's very individual. When you've met one NT, you've met one NT. No two people with the condition are exactly the same. Yeah, like a lot of people might think, because they all have neurotypicality, that must mean that they're all the same, but they're really not. It's also more common among females than males, but at the very least it's diagnosed more. But of course, going by like what you heard in the previous talk, obviously the amount of females who are diagnosed as autistic the amount of females who are autistic isn't necessarily known because a lot of people aren't diagnosed. So the numbers, it may actually be equal. So neurotypicality could be equally common among both men and women. Okay, now no one knows. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention is. Oh wait, what am I doing? What am I doing? Go back. Yeah. Also, it affects 99 out of 100 people in this country. There is no known cause for this condition, but it has been suggested that it's to do with neurotypicality tends to run in families. That tends to be agreed on, I'd say. Oh, what just happened there? Okay, now communication difficulties. Yeah, people with this condition do actually have communication difficulties, believe it or not. There often are some communication barriers. For one thing, they speak in code. They say one thing but mean something completely different. They use really unclear language, which may not necessarily mean exactly what they're saying, yet they expect everyone else to just naturally pick up on what they're meant to mean, or what they're meant to be thinking just by saying something which doesn't literally mean what they're saying. They may ask questions that they don't want an honest answer to. For example, an NT might say, "Do I look fat today?" And apparently, regardless of what you actually think, the answer is always, the answer they always want to hear is no. Now, of course, one thing those of us who don't have this condition don't really understand is that, one thing that we do understand rather, is that there isn't really a point in asking a question if you don't want the truth. Like, if you're going to get offended by being called fat, then you shouldn't ask. But people with this condition often struggle to understand this. And what we do have to do is actually have understanding. We need to be understanding of this fact and actually accept them for who they are. But these difficulties do tend to provide quite a communication barrier between people with this condition and the rest of us. Okay, now, another thing that NTs tend to do is they'll sign emails or social media posts with kisses, which is basically a few lowercase x's. Apparently that basically means kisses. Now, why they do this actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because at the end of the day, now of course in some cases it makes sense, obviously. But what I'm saying, like, if you send them to somebody you're close to, that makes sense. But what I don't understand is when they send them to literally anybody, no matter who they are. I'm kind of like, isn't that why is that like the expected thing to do, to send kisses after literally anything you've just said, no matter who it's to? I mean, imagine if this was real life, like in social media. And basically, imagine if basically right after somebody had said something to a complete stranger, they went and kissed them. That would be considered completely socially inappropriate, yet online, it's considered the socially appropriate thing to do it. Now, of course, but people with this condition tend to struggle to understand that this doesn't make sense, if you know what I'm saying. Oh, it's awkward, this clicker, isn't it? Also, another thing that they do, they enjoy small talk. They enjoy talking about things that don't really matter at all. Example, things like say clothes and shoes and what they've been up to this past week, the weather, this stuff which isn't all that interesting. In fact, they tend to think that if you talk about something which actually is interesting, they might get bored. They'd rather talk about these other stuff. Yeah, like I said, they may be uninterested when you're speaking about a topic. They may find interesting topics boring. Another thing is, NTs tend to enjoy something called eye contact, which is where they like to look directly into your eyes, which could very well make you feel very uncomfortable, like they're looking right through your very soul. In fact, they may even think you're rude if you're not giving it, if you don't give it to them back. Now, stereotypical behaviours. NTs do actually have some stereotypical behaviours. When it comes to, say, like after a big exhausting day of work, they like to go into these buildings with loud music and flashing lights and doing strange stereotypical behaviours and movements. Things like this. Now, the name for these movements is clubbing it. Now, it has been suggested that therapy could be used to help NTs to find a more socially acceptable. But many NTs don't really want this therapy, they want acceptance and understanding. Okay, now, obsessions. Now, I know it tends to be said that those people who don't have neurotypicality are the ones who have obsessions, but neurotypicals do tend to as well in their own way. Should we say, they tend to be very obsessive about social rules, which aren't black and white at all in a lot of cases. So you have to, when they're not black and white and when they're not like set in stone, it's hard to really understand why they exist. But like they'll insist that you have to say exactly, that you can't say exactly, or you don't necessarily have to say exactly what you mean, like they speak in code, and they also, if they want to ask a question, they don't necessarily want an honest answer, and all these other things as well. And as well as this, things like, say, when you have a knife and fork, they'll insist on holding your knife in your right hand and your fork in your left hand. But many of us who don't have the condition don't understand why this actually is. Why is there a set way of holding a knife and fork? Yeah. Another thing is they tend to struggle with empathy. They struggle to empathise with those of us who don't have this, who aren't neurotypical, shall we say. They tend to struggle to understand the mind of autistic people. And they struggle to put themselves in autistic people's shoes, because they don't have this condition themselves. Now, in severe cases of neurotypicality, people can also be extremely disorganised. When it comes to, say, shelving things like books, or CDs, or DVDs, or whatever, they'll tend to have them all, like, say, in the wrong order. And not facing the right way, not straight, or anything like that. Now, a lot of the time, those of us who don't have this condition, really, we tend to get annoyed by this and feel like everything should be in the right order. But people with this condition just don't know any better than to not notice these details. These are very important details. Okay, now, neurotypicals can also get very emotional as well, and maybe unable to remove their emotions from disagreements. And sometimes they're less likely to think logically and more emotionally. NTs are so focused on the big picture that they miss the details that the rest of us take for granted. Yeah. Now, it's very important to be very careful about the words you use when addressing NTs. Many people actually find the term NT offensive. Now, some people prefer to say that they have neurotypicality because, like, they feel like the condition is separate from them. They don't want to be defined as nothing more than their disorder, should we say. But there are others who prefer to say that they are neurotypicalistic because they see the condition as a part of who they are, if you know what I'm saying. They don't want it to be separate from them. Also, there has been suggested the term allistic is used as well. Other terms. And there are also others who don't like labels as well. Now, you have to be very careful about what term you use when addressing entities. It's probably important to ask the person, would you prefer to be called, let's say you're neurotypical, or you have the condition, or like, how would you like me to word it? But in the end, perhaps it might just be better. Some of them might take the view that you should just call them by their names. Now, if anyone is interested, I've written a book, My Life with Autism, called Thinking Club, a film strip of my life as a person with autism. I've got some copies of the book with me. Also, feel free to follow me on social media as well. We've got some business cards. Oh dear, some of these logos aren't quite lining up with the links, are they? That wasn't the case when it was put together, when downloading it. Now, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Goodbye.
Huge thanks to Alex for that very, very insightful twist on us neurotypicals. It was very enlightening and insightful. Thank you so much. Okay, so last but not least, we have another gentleman called Lawrence Mitchell here to talk about relationships, dating, and everything in between. Okay, so Lawrence Mitchell, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Because we're doing the have I got your attention?
We're ready? Just check that's all.
My name is Lawrence Mitchell, and I was an adult diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, ADHD, when I was 49 years old, and that was only a couple of years ago, but you don't have to worry about that. Sometimes I do get things wrong though, but it's very, very interesting just listening to how people label, talking about NTs for instance. When I actually write about neurotypicals, I actually put in brackets non-autistic because, look at me, this is typical me. Things will always fall apart. Nothing less than myself, but anyway, that's another story. What I'm not here to talk to you about is some of the difficult areas of the book. For argument's sake, I walked into a police station 3 years ago and reported historical sexual abuse when I was in my childhood, although that is part of the story, and really the whole story is about what can go wrong in a life of a man who's been diagnosed later on in life with Asperger's, as I just said. And so as I said, I was, well, one goes down the road. So I had a relationship with sexual abuse, and it was reported to the police 3 years ago. Very, very interestingly, as late as last year, I was having this conversation with my son, who I don't speak very, very often about, my eldest of my 2 children. And he said, "Dad, don't you remember Abby, that's my youngest daughter, she's now 28, and she also works for a children's charity. And she actually came running out to tell Mum that she had been touched by a very, very dear friend." And I vaguely remembered that, but that actually sparked off something that happened to me probably when I was 6 or 7 years old, when a friend of the family, very, very close friend, and I remember running out to my mum to say to her, "Mum, you know, I've been touched and I feel very, very uncomfortable." And you've got to understand, I don't know that I've got autism, Asperger's, and probably when I was a young child, I was probably lower functioning or autistic. And And I think when you read in the papers and you read in the media, there's so much about sexual abuse at the moment, especially with celebrities, but you don't hear much about what goes on in the general population. Reading my book will make you understand a little bit more. And I've also got a self-help website, which I'm going to be talking about very shortly. The point I'm trying to make, I think the danger, particularly for parents who have children, and not just children who are on the spectrum, but children in general, they have to be very, very aware of leaving any friend alone with that child. But again, it's probably a very, very difficult and tenuous area to know exactly what, but that's just my own personal opinion. Anyway, just to give you a little bit of a recap, I've spent several years in America going to top major professional autism conferences where I met many psychologists, neuroscientists, and I was guided in certain areas. So it's not a case of just writing a book. Anyway, I decided to make my book a psychological thriller, partially because my life coincided in some ways with a rather notorious Welsh businessman, a multimillionaire who murders an escort. And there are certain things that he did which has happened to me. So in some respects, I'm not necessarily proud of my past, but I felt it was important to get the message out into the public domain. Now, so my book is called Aspie and Me, and it's the relationship between the main character Hartley and his Aspie self, and it's written as a dialogue. I have a very, very good friend whose name is Ria. She's my confidant, or rather she's Hartley's confidant. Hartley actually plays my part in my life. And it was, of course, the hard, tough part was actually separating the Hartley self from the Asperger self. But I think I've done a pretty good idea of it in the book. Certainly my editor thinks so. Anyway, so what you'll actually find, this is actually a screenshot of my home page. You see my book, that's Aspie, that's me, Hartley. And as a child, I would feel very, very safe by a wall. I was probably low functioning autistic when I was 3 years old. I wouldn't play with the other children in the class. I did my own thing. I preferred looking at a wall. And that lasted for many years. Even today, I have problems not looking at a wall. So the website, aspieandme.com, is actually the self-help part of the book. And the idea is, if you were to read my book, of an adult was to read my book, and I know a couple of friends of mine whose 25-year-old sons have actually read the book, and they found it very, very helpful, even though it does sort of cross into areas where there is where there can be much sexual tension. But I'm not, as I said to you, I'm not here to talk about that part of the story. More about how you can actually get benefit out of the story by seeing what is on the website. When I was writing my book, I created hundreds of comments looking at situations, incidents, circumstances, and I tried to work out alternative strategies, what ifs, etc. And some of these examples are actually on my website. What you'll also find on the website is my original diagnosis by the Priory Hospital back in 2002. Now, what the story is also about, and there's a very, very sad part of it, it also brings my wife into the story. But I had to be very, very careful to protect my children because unfortunately she committed suicide 2 years after my diagnosis. So, in the book, she actually, the name of the character is actually Jackie. But anyway, so I'll carry on. So what does Aspie want? And this is a very interesting thought. What does Aspie want? If I were to say, turn around to you and say there's no such thing as Asperger's syndrome. Now, of course, a lot of Aspies would probably throw stones at me. What if I said to you, and many top psychotherapists, psychologists actually will agree with this statement, that every one of us is on the spectrum, because we all have our own weird ways. We all have our own idiosyncrasies, our own way of doing things. In fact, every one of us is unique. Even identical twins aren't identical. But so that is one way of looking at it. But in this story, I used to be a very successful international antiques dealer. This was me personally. And when I used to go all around the world, to America, to the Far East, buying my antiques and bringing them back to England and selling them. The 1980s and the 1970s were marvellous years where one could easily make money, not like today, not like the internet's come along and it makes everyone an expert. It's very easy to be an expert, isn't it? All you have to do is to print out a page from the internet and you can become that page. So anyway, the whole idea of splitting up Aspie from the self, here is the Asperger's character wants recognition for all his talents, all the wonderful things he could do for Hartley if Hartley would only listen. The problem Hartley's got, and Hartley's very, very self-centered, he's very much into himself, he likes to think of himself as being the centre of attention. He doesn't have time for his Asperger's self. All he really, and really and truly his Asperger's self is sick and tired of being left out of the picture and being blamed for everything that went wrong, his personal relationships, the business relationships. And now I could tell you there was a particular client I had where I actually turned up. It was in America one day. She'd invited me out to dinner. I didn't know that I was supposed to bring a box of chocolates or flowers, and I certainly didn't know anything about table manners, but that is also in the story. But just to give you an idea, not that I'd like to demonstrate it, just imagine there is a busy main road, right? It's the middle of the rush hour. You could blindfold me and I could walk across the street and I would not be hit by any vehicle. And that is because of my Asperger's. It's got this amazing talent of awareness, phenomenal awareness. Another one of my talents is, for instance, I found my way up here. I could almost drive back up here from London blindfolded and I would find my way. I do not need satellite navigation. The only reason I use satellite navigation is to help me with traffic. It's because I've got a photographic memory, not because I know street names. I don't know any street names, but I can remember a puddle or a tree, but that tree gets cut down, I'm stumped. Actually, that's very good. That came out very, very naturally. It wasn't part of the... so I'm glad you laughed. Isn't that wonderful as well? It shows here is someone who's on the spectrum, who laughs, who has humour. And most adult children are not supposed to have humour. Sorry, it's quite good. So here you say, Aspie feels he has little chance of hearing his voice heard. He's so distraught with anxiety that he's left with only one option: to murder. And so a murder has actually been brought into the story, and it's been brought in part by this, because of this Welsh businessman. I was trying to look at different ways I could end the book, and the book actually ends on a cliffhanger. There's actually going to be a part two, and the question the reader will have to work out: does Aspie actually murder, and who is going to be his victim? It might surprise you who his victim is going to be. If I were to tell you that really Aspie is the type of person who likes to scale a rock face, and 3 years ago I was actually dangling 150 feet above the ground on a rock face, having never rock climbed before or even given a lesson, but that's another story. So you can't really see it, it's much too small, but it's about readers' comments, including a psychologist about the story. And again on this slide, exactly the same, something very, very similar. Now, what we also find on the website is the characters in the story. Now, here is the main character, Hartley, that's me, and the next slide is Aspie, about Aspie, and then you get a little bit about Jackie, who explained was my wife. And I actually haven't listed all the characters here. No, actually that's... No. So anyway, this is a woman called Mania, who was very much a narcissist, and it was a very, very horrible relationship that I actually had, where because of her, she was an alcoholic, and you know, that's the last type of relationship an Aspie wants to be with. Anyway, since I know I don't have a lot of time, I'm probably coming up to about 12 minutes, I want to give you an example of how intrusive anxieties can be. Now, this is where I'm not very, very good. I'm not very good with trying to remember, you know, the dinosaur films. What was the famous dinosaur movies?
Jurassic Park.
Sorry, Jurassic Park. Now imagine, imagine Tyrannosaurus Rex, who is supposed to be king of the dinosaurs. Now bring him into the 21st century. Just try and picture it yourself. What would you do if you suddenly saw one in front of you and he was as real as be? Would you just stand there in absolute amazement or shock? And if, of course, if you stand there and do an absolute nothing, you'll probably be history. Well, that actually happened to me when I was cycling along a canal in a part of London which is through to an industrial area, and I somehow transformed a real-life Tyrannosaurus Rex that caused such a terrible anxiety that I actually came off my bike, and I was actually airborne over the canal, and I actually landed underneath a bridge where I literally cowered, shaking in absolute fear for several minutes before the sensation died down. And I think this is one of the, why I particularly mentioned this. I think T-Rex and dinosaurs, you know, when we are children, you know, we often go to bed and we start wondering what monster is lurking in the drawers or under their bed. And of course, with any child, or adult for that matter, after the story I've just told you, you know, with all the sensory issues, and I've had plenty to contend with, and all children have plenty to contend with. And then another reason for my book is to make you aware of the sensory challenges that adults on the spectrum have, because you've got a great support here, as is at all the shows, but once an adult reaches about 30, there is virtually no support whatsoever. Support literally withers away. There's no real support in a GP surgery. Yes, one can go to a CBT therapist and have other therapy, but for someone like myself, I've only got myself, and where does the responsibility lie? Anyway, so if we go to the last slide, there you are. I should have made him much bigger. It's the head of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So he is the last character in my story, and he does appear in 1 or 2 chapters. Anyway, the cost of my book is £14.99. I have 1 or 2 copies here with me, which I'm quite happy to sign. You can also buy it on Amazon, and it's also downloadable on Kindle. And especially if you know anyone, any adults particularly, on the spectrum, I would say go to see my website, which is www.aspieandme.com.
Big thanks to Tom and your talk and your very kind of honest experience in your life. Thank you very much.
Right.
And I'd like to say again a massive thank you to all 6 TAD talkers today. All been amazingly inspirational, all completely different stories. If any of you are interested in telling your own TAD tale or talk, please get in touch with us. I'll be around for the next until 4 o'clock, where we can change details and hopefully sign some of you guys up to be with Tom and the rest of you guys who are today. Okay, thank you.